Go ahead and start. I think there'll be a couple more people joining us, but I want to make sure that we get through all of our topics today. So welcome back, everybody. Today, we're going to be talking about 20th century literature. I'll do the overview. This is our last unit. So we're going into the 6th and final unit. I'll show you the unit also on the Blackboard, so that's available to you. I have the final exam study guide ready for you also, so I'll do a little tour of that. We'll talk a little bit about discussion number 9, the very last discussion. So this week is the end of discussions. I'm sure you're all torn up about that. Maybe we'll also talk about essay number 2. I know there have been some questions and I've been getting some emails from people about finding sources and that kind of thing. So maybe I can give a little bit of direction in that neighborhood too. So let's start with the walkthrough of the Blackboard, the new unit. It's set up just like all of the other units, but this time we're talking about the 20th century. I don't think that we will get into the contemporary literature. I think we'll only have time to do pretty much the 20th century. There is a concept of contemporary literature, meaning the things that have been written very recently. And I don't think we're going to have time for that because if you look on the calendar, we're dealing with the 20th century this week. We don't have class this Friday. And then also next week, Tuesday and Thursday. Friday next week is kind of a review day. Maybe we'll have to finish up from the garden party, but that's the last class day that we'll have, will be Friday the 7th. And then the week after that is going into final exams. We're not meeting that week. That's a week for you to work on your exam. And the end of the term is the 14th. So we're not going to be meeting any time after that. My grades are due on the 17th and they'll be finished also for East at that point. So we really only have 2 more weeks of classes left for this course. So anyway, this is the unit for that. You should read through the introductory material that's there and the objectives. The objectives are pretty much consistent throughout the course, learning about how 20th century literature is influenced by history and also, has contributed to the larger discussion about British literature in general or English literature. The readings are listed here. This Thursday, we will talk about these 5 poems. They represent kind of a broad span of 100 years of writing. So on Thursday, I will talk about these 5 poems. They're all pretty short, under a page. So it'd be good if you could look at all those before Thursday. That way it makes sense when I'm talking about them and showing the qualities of 20th century literature in those poems. Here's a PDF of those selections if you don't want to skip around in the big textbook there. Next week, we will work on 2 pieces of fiction, The Mark on the Wall by Virginia Woolf and The Garden Party by Catherine Mansfield. So that's coming up next week. And then that's pretty much it for the readings for the term. There are some notes here on modernism. I'm going to touch on that briefly and postmodernism today in my intro, but there's more details and more specifics in these 2 sections of the unit that you can read that the department set up for you here. Here's where you can submit essay 2. Essay number 2 is due a week from today. That's the research paper. I'll touch on that again in a second. Here is the final exam study guide is listed here for you. I'm going to touch on that too in a few minutes. And then the usual 2 sections are additional materials and then all the links to the lectures. They're all right there. Same setup as usual. Let me go back and talk about essay number 2. Many people have been, well, not many, I want to say a handful of people have been sending me emails to help them with their research or to look at drafts of their paper, which is perfectly fine. I'm glad to do that for you. I'm going to bring up the assignment sheet here. Did that this morning too. I wonder why. I'll have to fix that. It's also over here on the calendar, essay number 2. Some of the questions that I'm getting or the help that people are requesting has to do with finding sources. And so I just wanted to spend a little time talking about that because I remember asking first semester when we were doing our research paper, do y'all know how to research in JSTOR? And everybody kind of said yes or I don't know, nothing. So I just assumed that everybody did. But now I'm noticing that some of the questions I'm getting indicate that you might want a little bit of a refresher on specifically how to study, how to look up things in JSTOR, because you can't use it like Google. The search will yield thousands of results if you do it like that. That's not the way to work JSTOR. So can you put in the chat like a thumbs up or a yes if you want me to spend maybe 10 or 15 minutes talking about how you search in JSTOR to get better results? Is that an issue for this class or is that not an issue for this class? Not an issue? Okay. If you are finding that you're getting thousands of results on your topic, it's the way that you're searching. So when you search, you should be getting a limited number of results returned to you. I went over it last period. So maybe also, I was just thinking that you guys might want to know how to do that. You can send me a private chat if you don't want to put it in front of everybody. But, learning is not a single player sport. Learning is a team sport. So I'm here to support you through that. But if I spend time on stuff that you don't need me to spend time on, and I don't spend time on things that you do need me to spend time on, that's not effective use of our time. So I'm going to assume, since I only see one response there, that you do not need me to go through how to research on a database using like Boolean searches and stuff like that. Last chance. Okay. Well, then if you look over here, you'll see that I've also included some other sources for you using a website called Voice of the Shuttle. Here are some period pages where you can go to get even more information. You do not have to use internet sources. You can just use everything from JSTOR if you want. But the English department at STC wants to make sure that you know how to effectively use the databases. And so that's why they want 3 at least from JSTOR. There's also a website called Project Muse. I don't know if that, I think Voice of the Shuttle is better, but Project Muse could also help you. And so there is a link there in case you need more sources besides JSTOR. Are there any questions about the topics? At this point, you should have a thesis statement, probably a draft that you're working on. The paper's due a week from today. Sometimes I'm noticing when people email me for help that they are doing research sort of backwards. If you, for example, this is just an example, if you were doing research on Shakespeare, like say you decided to go with option 2, and you wanted to work with the work of Shakespeare, the first thing to do is to create a thesis statement, right? Because if you just go to JSTOR or if you go to Google or any of those other web references that I showed you and type in Shakespeare, you're going to get millions of responses. And then it's not, you're going to have to like read through them and search through them. That's just going to take more time than you even have between now and when the paper's due. So the thing to do is to craft your thesis first. You know that the paper has to be on the topic of what is the influence of Shakespeare in English literature or English language. So you should refine your thesis first and then search based on the keywords in your thesis. Like do a Boolean search, and that way you should end up with maybe, I got a search of Shakespeare last period down to 8, that all of them would have been good for the paper. So I was demonstrating for them because they wanted me to show them how to do a Boolean search in JSTOR. So if you just start with a general thing like Shakespeare, you're never going to find, you're going to have to try to find articles and make them fit into your paper, and that doesn't ever really play out well. If you already have your thesis, then just search on those keywords. So like sometimes people will be like, I can't find any sources. And I'm like, well, what's your thesis? I don't have one. Well, do that first, and then I'll help you find some sources, because what about Shakespeare, right? If you search, you could find about his children, his, medical history, like 95 different things, this play, that play. So narrowing it down based on your thesis is a good way to go with that. But like I said, if you want to send me your thesis and get some feedback, if you need help finding sources, you can just email me, and I will help you with that. Or if you want me to look at a draft, the paper needs to be 6 to 8 pages long. That does not include the works cited. Works cited should be on its own page. A lot of people got deductions on the last research paper because they added their works cited to the bottom of the final page, and it should not be like that. It should be on its own page. So keep in mind that you should have 5 minimum sources. You can have more, and 3 of them should be from JSTOR. So if you have any questions about the paper, just communicate with me. I'm glad to help you through that. Maybe also the class period next Tuesday be kind of like any final questions that you have, but the paper should be coming in anytime between now and next Tuesday, so that I have time to grade them before the exam pops up and we need to grade that one. Any final questions about the essay? All right, then let's look at the study guide for the exam. You can find it here in the unit. So the exam is set up basically the same as the midterm. I did reduce the number of questions slightly, just because it was taking people, some people, it took them 3 hours to do the test, and they made an 89 or whatever. Other people were taking a long time to take the test, which means I don't know why that was happening. I can guess, but I'm not going to speculate here. In any case, again, it's not timed, but it has to be completed in one sitting. The exam opens on May 10th, and it closes on May 13th. So sometime in there, you need to schedule your time to take the exam. We will not be meeting during that time anymore, so you can use class time for that, or studying, or what have you. But that's the window for taking the test. If you're having trouble with connectivity, if you think your internet might go out, you can make arrangements with me. We'll find a spot for you on campus where you can come up here and take your exam, and that way you don't have to be interrupted. So just let me know if that is something that you would like to do. Number of questions, I reduced the short answer questions to 10 and the essays to 3, which means that each question will be worth more points, but the idea is that there are fewer of them to answer. So it's gonna weigh out one way or the other. But basically the same sort of thing. I've listed for you by each time period that we've studied the terms that could pop up on the exam. So it's one of those things where it's random which 10 concepts or questions you get, and which ones you have to then connect back to the piece of literature. So it could be any of these from the 18th century. It could be any of these from the Romantic period, any of these from Victorian, and these are the ones that are coming up that we'll be talking about this week and next week in the modern era in 20th century. So you can see that each one of these sections is set up the same way, with the background material, where to look in the textbook. Maybe if I gave a slideshow, I think I did a slideshow on all of the time periods leading into them, study guides and videos of the lectures that I gave over the different topics. So it's set up the same way for each one of the units. Obviously, I don't have the lecture videos yet for the 20th century because I'm going to be making them starting today. So those will be popping up on the study guide as we continue through this week and next week with the 20th century. So any questions on how to use the study guide to prepare for the final? Just a reminder that this is 20% of your overall course grade. So you want to make sure that the final is an opportunity for you to maintain or improve your grade. So that's why I'm giving you the study guide 2 weeks before the exam begins so that you have time to work on it. There's a day set aside next Friday for us to go over anything. By then I'm going to expect that you've worked through the study guide, and on that day, if there's anything that you want me to spend some time talking about, I'll take questions and answers on that day. And then you still have some time before your exam is due. All right, I don't see anything in the chat. So before I go into the 20th century, the last point of discussion today is discussion number 9, which is the one for this week. So this week is the last discussion. The post is due on Friday. They're having you write in this time about the satire that we see in the importance of being earnest. It says, compare and contrast the Victorian satire we see in the importance of being earnest with the 18th century satire exhibited by part 1 of Gulliver's Travels. So you're being asked to sort of say, what are some similarities and differences between the satire that we see in Ernest and the satire that we see in Gulliver? I gave you some ideas here. Consider Wilde and Swift's narrative techniques, purposes, characters, themes, and subject matter. So there's some different aspects that you could tie into the satire from each of them. I want to point out something about compare contrast writing that I've noticed that I feel would help people improve on their scores in this last discussion, and that is that compare contrast writing involves more than putting two things side by side. For example, if you do a section of your response explaining the satire in the importance of being earnest, and another section of your response explaining the satire in Gulliver's Travels, that's not the job. The job is to say how those things intersect or how they do not intersect. So you cannot just say, here's this and here's this and call it a compare contrast. The best thing to do is to take item number 1, in this case, it would probably be the importance of being earnest, discuss the satire in that piece, and then introduce the second item and show how there are similarities, like bounce the similarities and differences off of that first thing that you mentioned. So as you're talking about Swift, you're talking about the satire that he creates, you can say, just like in the importance of being earnest, Gulliver's Travels also does this or does not do this. In opposition to, Oscar Wilde's work, Swift does this other thing. So just putting two things side by side is not comparing and contrasting. So if you do that, then that's not really answering the question. You have to do the, bridging of the ideas between the two of them. So hopefully that will help you. There is a secondary question here, which is, what do these satires tell us about their surface versus their deeper values? So in each time period, what do we learn about the superficial and the deeper values of people during these times? So that's the discussion for this week. Any questions on that? All right, then I'm going to spend, I shouldn't have closed that yet. I'm going to spend the rest of the time talking about the introduction to 20th century literature. You can find the slideshow that I'm going to go through right here under additional materials in that unit. So the 20th century is mainly where we're going to spend our time. We're not really going to have time to go into the 21st century literature, which would be contemporary literature, Contemporary and modern are not the same thing. Modern is a period, and that period is finished. And they moved into postmodern in the sort of like toward the second half of the 20th century. And now we just call it contemporary because we don't know what literary history is going to call this time period that we're in right now. But I did put an image there to sort of represent the qualities of 20th century literature, and it's not positive. Also, you can tell from the image behind me, which is an image depicting World War I and trench warfare. And you can tell that 20th century literature starts off as, you know, kind of depressing and very much concerned with the health of the world, and society is blighted by the burdens of, you know, those kinds of thoughts, and also with war, because the 20th century starts with World War I. And so this image shows a figure who is obviously perplexed, you can tell from the eyebrows, but also sort of deep in thought and is absorbing some of the background, sort of muddled gray feelings. This is Picasso. So I feel like that was a good representation to talk about 20th century literature. So just in terms of context for, you know, historical considerations, you'll remember from your history that this is a time period where things are changing very quickly. There are economic changes, new vocabularies are coming on board, like this is the birth of sociology and anthropology and psychology and those types of ideas. Also, everyday life is changing for people quite rapidly, and this makes people feel unsettled or uncomfortable. Electricity is invented, and people go from lighting lamps to turning a switch. And to us, that might seem minor, or it might seem like a benefit. And of course, it is, electricity is, but it's also the pace at which life is changing. And if you just think about the distress that we've felt over this last year of having to change the way that we do so many things, you can kind of understand how people in the early 20th century might have felt uncomfortable with all of these changes happening at once. Now, all of a sudden, there are airplanes and cars and mass-produced medications and appliances. You know, there's washing machines, and the pace at which things are happening is increasing, and that makes people, you know, unsettled. Also, there's changing in terms of just the hierarchy of human beings. Women get the right to vote in the UK in 1928. And so that also changes the societal norms and expectations of the time period. When we talk about modernism, the thing to think about is war and the effects of war, because that's really where the movement of modernism comes from. World War I took up the majority of all of the first quarter of the century, and even lingered farther into that. The war didn't take that long. But remember that we're talking about Britain. When we talk about World War I in America, we talk about, and World War II also, we talk about sending our troops elsewhere. They went to, you know, the Pacific theater, or they went to the European theater. We didn't have fighting on our shores. We didn't have battlefields in the middle of our towns. But in Europe, they did. And if you've ever seen a movie like Saving Private Ryan, or if you watch the first Wonder Woman movie, that takes place during World War I, and they show the trench warfare and the carnage that happened as a result of that. 16 million people died in World War I. And it's just where they first started to have automated weapons and tanks and things like that. So it caused a huge disruption, not just to the population, but also to the cities. They're just rubble. And it takes a long time for a country or even a city to recover from that. We didn't have that. We had casualties, of course, in World War I, but we didn't have our towns reduced to nothing. And in Europe, they did. So it's kind of a little different mindset for people in Britain. Also, the war caused Britain to really scale back its colonial ambitions. We talked about colonialism in the Victorian times, and they have to scale that back because they're unable financially to support colonialism any longer. And so they change the majority of their colonies over to commonwealths. So, countries like Canada are a commonwealth of Great Britain, but they're their own sovereign nation. So a lot of the places that had been colonialized were instead, kind of turned over to just being a part of the British Empire, but run by the people of that location. After World War I, we have, just like in America, an economic depression, but it was even worse in Europe because of the devastation that the war caused on the landscape and in the cities. So there's a little hiatus after World War I, but people are generally just trying to deal with the effects of the war and trying to come back from that. And just as that is starting to happen, enter World War II. And that also devastates, of course, the weapons that are used in World War II are more sophisticated and more targeted. And so there's just a whole nother level of destruction that occurs at that point too. So after World War II, this is all during the modernist period. After World War II, people came back, soldiers came back from the war and people tried to recover from the Second World War. And a lot of people left Great Britain or Europe in general. Some people emigrated to Europe. And so there was a lot more diversity happening in the second half of the 20th century in Great Britain. There's more immigration. And so that caused people in Britain to start thinking about, what does it mean to be British? If we say this is a British tradition, what does that mean if 20% of our population is ethnically from somewhere else? And so there are those types of issues that start coming up in the second half of the 20th century: diversity and identity. Oh, I skipped one. Another thing that sometimes gets glossed over in history are the troubles in Ireland. They don't call it a war, but Ireland for a few centuries now has wanted to get out from underneath the reign of Britain. They still do in some ways. And in the 1960s, there were a lot of violent protests, not just because many of the Irish wanted to make their own sovereign nation, but also because the people in Northern Ireland were feuding with the people in Southern Ireland. They don't call it Southern, I just call it Ireland, but based on religious beliefs. So there's a lot of disturbance in Ireland in the 1960s, sort of like in mid-century, and that breeds a lot of the types of poetry and literature that we see from those time periods. All right, so let's talk about characteristics of 20th century literature. Poetry, I kind of broke it into 3 different sections for each part of the century because obviously things progress. So with poetry, we see in the early 20th century an emphasis on imagism. I'm going to talk about imagism and show you an example of it on Thursday. But imagism is sort of a snapshot poem. It's a moment in time, and they're usually quite short, like 2 or 3 lines. That moves into what we call postmodernism, which is sort of an identity crisis of a society, I guess you could say. What's our purpose here? Why are we existing? That kind of thing. And then late 20th century, the focus is on diversity. There are a lot of different voices that we hear in poetry toward the latter part of the 20th century because of that influx of immigration. Fiction, we have early 20th century modernism, which is a reaction to the war and, sort of the idea of how can human beings be cruel to each other in this way? What is it that makes us so that we can't get along? That kind of thing. There's some pages in Blackboard on postmodernism and modernism that you can look over, but I'm going to be touching on it when I do the material in the next 3 class periods. During the mid-century with fiction, we see more of a lean toward realism, perception. What you see is what you think is real, and the struggle to know. In the late 20th century, again, diversity of cultural voices, untold stories, the stories that were suppressed because they were in the minority. So just like in America, we see toward the end of the 20th century and moving into the 21st century, a lot more voices coming forward and being published so that we can see lots of different mindsets in terms of cultural voices. With drama, we're not going to read a drama, but just so that you know for your notes, in the early 20th century, a lot of British drama was challenging complacency. Let's not just accept the status quo, let's fight for improvements. Mid 20th century was about minimalism. A lot of dramatic productions in the mid 20th century in Britain and in America had like no sets, just like imaginary sets, so that the focus was on the character more than it was on the setting, and also using that to create a social critique. Late 20th century, legal reform, making some choices about making statements that are political, and then also diversification of voices in drama too. So here are some key authors of the 20th century. I'll point out which ones we are going to touch on in the next couple days. Virginia Woolf was an English novelist. We're going to read a short piece by her called The Mark on the Wall. James Joyce was Irish. We're not going to read anything in this cycle, but we already did read Araby first semester. He was Irish. W.B. Yeats, we're going to read a poem of his, also an Irish poet. Dylan Thomas was British. Do not go gentle into that good night. We're going to read for Thursday. Seamus Heaney is a writer from the second half of the 20th century. You might know his name because he was the one who translated our version of Beowulf that's in our textbook. We're going to read one of his own pieces called Blackberry Picking for Thursday. Margaret Atwood is Canadian. She's still alive. Canadians aren't British per se, but they are under the Commonwealth of Britain. So in anthologies, they sometimes include Canadians and Australians and people like that that are still connected to the British Commonwealth. So Margaret Atwood is a novelist and a poet. You might have heard her name before because she wrote a novel called A Handmaid's Tale, and they turned that into a show on Hulu. Elizabeth Moss is the key actor in that. Chinua Achebe is a writer of Nigerian descent. We're not reading anything by him, but he has several good short stories and also the novel Things Fall Apart. So you can see the different voices. These pictures don't all look like the same person. Like, remember when we were looking at the Romantics, it was sort of like the same portrait over and over and over again, and it's not like that in the 20th century. And the last example is Samuel Beckett, who's a playwright. He writes existential pieces like Waiting for Godot, but we're not going to read any of those plays. We don't have time. And that's the end of the slideshow. Are there any questions on that information? All right, so for Thursday, please read the poetry selections that are here. I'm going to touch on the qualities of these poems that demonstrate the qualities of 20th century writing. It's kind of weird to just pick 5 poems to represent 100 years, but that's the nature of this course. So I'll do my best to show you the range through those poetry works. And then next week we have 2 pieces of fiction to read by Virginia Woolf and Catherine Mansfield, one on each of the days next week. You can get a PDF here of just these selections if you don't want to go through that long textbook PDF. All right, any remaining questions before we finish for today? All right, I hope you all have a good day, and I'll see you next time.